The atmosphere in the Grand Hall was thick with tension. Alien species from across the galaxy had gathered, their eyes filled with anticipation. At the long, polished table sat human representatives, their faces calm but their eyes sharp. The beings from other worlds had no idea what was about to unfold. They expected the humans to comply with the terms they had carefully laid out, to bend under the weight of their demands. After all, the humans were just one species among many, their power not as vast as some of the more established civilizations in the galaxy. But there was something in the air, something different about today's negotiations. The alien leaders spoke one by one, their voices echoing through the hall, each one pushing their own agendas. The humans listened intently, absorbing every word, but their silence spoke volumes. It wasn't just a passive silence, it was the calm before a storm. The humans had heard it all before. They knew how to navigate these complex talks, how to balance power, strategy, and diplomacy. But this time, something had changed within them. They were no longer willing to play by the old rules. The aliens thought they could bully the humans into submission, but they hadn't accounted for the quiet strength that lay within them. Then, without a word, the human leader, a tall figure with sharp features and a commanding presence, stood up. The other species at the table paused, confused. The humans didn't look at each other. They didn't exchange knowing glances. They simply stood in unison, pushing their chairs back in perfect synchrony. The aliens exchanged quick glances, a few muttering under their breath. What was happening? Were the humans so defeated already that they were giving up without a fight? The human leader took a step forward, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "We are done here." His words were calm, but laced with a finality that sent a shiver through the room. The alien leaders froze. They had prepared for this meeting for months, but never in their wildest dreams did they imagine this outcome. "You think you understand us, but you don't," the human leader continued. "You thought we would bend, but you failed to see what we were truly capable of." A murmur of confusion rippled through the hall, but before anyone could respond, the humans turned and began walking away, heading for the exit without a second glance. The alien representatives were left in stunned silence. Some watched in disbelief, others in confusion. What had just happened? No one moved for what felt like an eternity. The humans were gone, their exit as quiet as their entrance. It wasn't until the human delegation had completely disappeared from view that the chaos began. At first, the alien species tried to brush it off. Surely, the humans would return. This had to be some sort of test, right? A psychological game to throw the others off balance. But as minutes turned into hours and still there was no sign of the humans, panic began to spread. The galaxy had always relied on humans for their unique insights, their innovative technologies, and their ability to mediate conflicts. Without them, many of the galactic deals would fall apart. It was a well-known fact that the humans were not just an ordinary species, they had been the key to maintaining balance across the stars. Their absence could mean disaster. As the hours turned into days, the reality of the situation set in. The other species began to realize that this wasn't a simple power play or a temporary absence. The humans had walked away and were not coming back. The galaxy had just lost its most valuable player in the game of intergalactic diplomacy, and no one knew how to handle it. A quiet panic began to spread. How would the galaxy continue without the humans' involvement? Would they have to find new ways to manage the countless issues the humans had helped solve? The uncertainty was overwhelming. The human leaders had always been an enigma to the galaxy's inhabitants. No one fully understood how they thought or what motivated them, but everyone agreed on one thing. They were far more capable than anyone gave them credit for. In the past, humans had always been willing to negotiate, always willing to find common ground. But now, it seemed they had lost their patience. There was no offer of compromise, no hint of returning to the table. The decision to walk away was calculated. The humans had known for years that the galaxy had underestimated them, that their allies had grown complacent, thinking the humans could be manipulated like all the others. The humans had grown tired of being the saviors, the peacemakers, the ones who always fixed things. They had come to realize that no one truly appreciated their role. No one recognized how much they had sacrificed for the peace they had worked so hard to maintain. And now, they were done. As the galaxy began to feel the weight of the absence of human leadership, whispers started to spread. Some alien factions began to question the decision of the humans to abandon the negotiations. What was their true plan? Why had they left? The rumors grew, some suggesting that the humans had been secretly preparing for this moment for years, quietly building their strength, while others believed that they had simply given up on trying to save a galaxy that didn't appreciate them. One thing was clear: this was no ordinary negotiation. The humans weren't simply walking away from a deal. They were making a statement. It wasn't just about power, it was about respect. They had been pushed to the limit, and now they were showing the galaxy just how much they had underestimated them. The other species had no idea what they had lost. In the days that followed, the other species began to scramble. Plans that had been set in motion began to falter. Economic deals collapsed as human technology, once the backbone of many intergalactic trade routes, was no longer available. The military alliances that had been forged with humans, built on mutual trust and strength, began to weaken. The galaxy was beginning to feel the first signs of chaos. What the aliens didn't know was that the humans had already foreseen this. They had already planned for it. They knew that their absence would cause this panic, and they had already made their own arrangements. The galaxy, now left without the human mediators, would begin to fall apart. And the humans had no intention of fixing it. Not anymore. The first few weeks were the most chaotic. Factions that once relied on human support began to turn on each other. Tensions that had been kept in check by human diplomacy flared up as the various species jostled for power in a galaxy that suddenly seemed to have no center. In some corners of space, alliances began to collapse entirely. On the surface, it appeared that the galaxy was slowly unraveling, as if the threads that had once held it together were slowly being pulled apart. The aliens still didn't fully understand what had happened. Why had the humans walked away? Why had they turned their backs on the galaxy when their leadership was most needed? As the galaxy grew increasingly unstable, a few began to whisper about a great mistake. They hadn't just lost a negotiator. They had lost an entire way of thinking. The humans had once been seen as the glue that held the galaxy together, the peacemakers who always found a way to keep the peace. But now, their departure was starting to show its true consequences. Some began to question if they had ever truly understood the humans at all. What had they failed to see? In the midst of this growing uncertainty, the human leaders remained silent. They had made their point, and for the first time in years, they felt free. They no longer had to carry the weight of the galaxy's problems on their shoulders. But they knew, deep down, that their actions would change everything. The galaxy might not know it yet, but it was about to experience the consequences of underestimating humanity, and those consequences would soon become impossible to ignore. As the days passed, the consequences of the humans' departure began to unfold in ways the galaxy hadn't expected. What had seemed like a bold yet somewhat reckless move by the humans quickly spiraled into a crisis. At first, the aliens tried to hold it together, continuing with their business as usual. They hoped that the humans would come to their senses, that they would return to the table and restore the order that had been disrupted. But the humans were nowhere to be found, and with each passing day, the weight of their absence grew heavier. A few of the larger factions attempted to reach out. They sent envoys, messengers, and even diplomats to the human colonies, but every attempt was met with silence. No response. The humans had truly cut themselves off. The once steady flow of human innovation, technology, and resources to various parts of the galaxy had come to a screeching halt. Trade routes were abandoned, military alliances weakened, and the countless treaties that humans had helped broker began to unravel one by one. The galaxy was starting to feel the pressure. Within weeks, planets that had relied heavily on human technological advancements found themselves in dire straits. Industries that had been built around human engineering and design began to stagnate. Some species that had once been at the forefront of space exploration found themselves struggling to keep up with the rapid pace of technological growth. Without human ingenuity, their own progress began to slow. It wasn't just a matter of lost resources. It was the sudden realization that they had all been depending on humans for far more than they'd realized. In the heart of the galaxy, once bustling trade hubs now felt empty. The ships that had once filled the skies, traveling between planets and systems, were now fewer and farther between. Without the humans' expertise in keeping these routes open and functioning, the entire system was on the verge of collapse. People whispered about the human advantage, and some of the smaller factions began to grow desperate. Without the humans, they saw their futures growing dimmer by the day. Back in the vast, empty hall, where the negotiations had taken place, the alien leaders met again. But this time, their demeanor was much different. There was no longer the same arrogance in their voices, no longer the confidence that had filled the room when they thought they could simply push the humans aside. Now, a quiet panic had replaced that arrogance. They no longer spoke with the same certainty that they had before. Instead, they spoke in hushed tones, as if the very walls themselves might overhear their fear. "They can't be gone forever," one of the older species said, his voice cracking with uncertainty. "They'll come back. They have to." But another leader, younger and more pragmatic, shook his head. "No, they've left us. And we weren't ready for it." The realization that the humans had not only walked away but had also prepared for this moment, in silence and without their knowledge, began to sink in. There was a deep sense of regret hanging over the meeting, but no one knew what to do with it. They had underestimated the humans, thinking they could be easily manipulated or controlled. But the humans weren't just another species to command. They were a force unto themselves, capable of both great kindness and immense power. And now that the humans had withdrawn, the galaxy was left to pick up the pieces of a broken system. As the alien leaders argued and debated over what to do, a group of independent traders on the outer rim of the galaxy started to make moves of their own. These traders, who had often worked with the humans, saw an opportunity in the chaos. The human resources that had once been distributed in a balanced way were now up for grabs. Trade routes once controlled by large corporations and military alliances began to change hands. Smaller, lesser-known factions began to form their own deals, bypassing the once-established norms of galactic trade. This shift was subtle at first, but quickly became noticeable. Those who had once relied on human guidance now found themselves struggling to keep up with the rapid changes. The galaxy was no longer the steady, predictable place it had once been. And then came the first signs of the political fractures that would soon grow into full-blown conflicts. With the humans gone, power struggles erupted between the various alien factions. Alliances that had held strong for centuries began to falter. The once unified front of galactic governance fractured, as each species sought to protect their own interests. Without the neutral, steady hand of humanity guiding them, the galaxy began to tear itself apart. On the other side of the galaxy, smaller factions that had long been under the control of larger, more powerful civilizations started to push back. They had always felt like pawns in a much larger game, their resources being siphoned off by the more powerful players. Now, with the humans gone, they saw an opportunity to take control of their own futures. They no longer needed to rely on the bigger powers. In the absence of human diplomacy, these factions began to form their own coalitions, and the galaxy was suddenly filled with the sound of clashing ideologies, all competing for dominance. It wasn't long before rumors began to circulate, and whispers of rebellion started to spread through the galaxy like wildfire. There were those who believed that the humans had left the galaxy to its fate on purpose. Others thought that the humans had simply given up on a broken system, one that had failed to recognize their worth. Whatever the reason, the fact remained. The galaxy was spiraling into chaos, and there was no one to stop it. Back on Earth, the humans watched as events unfolded from a distance. They had known this would happen. They had known that their absence would cause a ripple effect across the galaxy. But they also knew that it was the only way to show the galaxy that they had underestimated them. The humans had always been the glue holding things together, but now they were no longer interested in being the peacekeepers. They were done with being the ones who fixed everyone else's problems. What the galaxy didn't know was that the humans had spent years quietly preparing for this moment. They had built alliances with species who had once been seen as insignificant. They had developed technologies that the galaxy couldn't even dream of. They had quietly been planning their own rise, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now that the galaxy was on the brink of collapse, the humans were ready to step in, not to save the galaxy, but to take control. In the coming weeks, the galaxy would begin to realize the true scale of the mistake they had made. As the last traces of human involvement faded, a new order would rise from the chaos. The humans would not return as diplomats or negotiators. They would return as rulers. And the galaxy, now weakened and divided, would have no choice but to accept this new reality. But for now, all they could do was watch as the humans' absence slowly suffocated the galaxy, one failing system at a time. And in the silence of space, as the galaxy grappled with the consequences of their actions, one thought echoed through every corner of the galaxy. They had underestimated the humans, and now they were about to pay the price. The first month without the humans was a strange one. The galaxy seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. Trade routes that had once hummed with activity were now eerily quiet. The spaceports that had been bustling with ships carrying goods, people, and information now stood almost deserted. It wasn't that the galaxy was no longer functioning, life went on, but it was the absence of something vital. Without the humans, everything felt incomplete, as if a key part of the puzzle had been taken away, leaving behind only chaos and uncertainty. Small alien factions that had once been content to remain in the background now found themselves scrambling to maintain their place in a suddenly unpredictable universe. With the larger, more powerful factions distracted and disorganized, these smaller species began to take chances they never would have before. Their leaders, once content with their lowly status, now saw opportunities to rise. The power vacuum left by the humans was a tempting one, and they moved quickly to claim their share of influence in the galaxy. But not everyone was ready to take action. Some species, the more stable and established ones, were slow to react. They had long relied on human intervention to keep the peace, and now they found themselves without direction. These species were used to wielding their power with authority, and the absence of human leadership left them uncertain, unsure of how to navigate this new, rapidly shifting galaxy. For many, it wasn't just about the loss of resources or technology. Though that was significant, it was the sudden lack of a diplomatic force that had always kept the peace. Humans had been the neutral party, the bridge between conflicting factions, the peacemakers who could always find a way to calm the storm. But now, that role was empty. No one else had been able to step into it. And without that mediator, the once stable relationships between the species began to crack. The first cracks began to appear when the Zorvans, an aggressive militaristic species, started making demands on the Grasians, a peaceful and technologically advanced race. The Grasians had once been able to rely on the humans to mediate their conflicts, but now, without that buffer, tensions escalated quickly. The Zorvans, seeing an opportunity in the power vacuum, pushed the Grasians harder than ever before, and without a neutral party to intervene, it was unclear how the situation would resolve. Soon after, similar stories began to unfold across the galaxy. The Wintari, a smaller but fiercely independent species, had long been part of a mutual defense pact with the humans. Now, isolated and vulnerable, they found themselves at odds with their former allies, the Iridians, who sought to expand their territories. Without the human presence to calm the situation, small skirmishes began to break out, and soon, An all-out conflict seemed inevitable. The galaxy's political landscape was changing, and no one knew exactly how far the ripple effects would reach. Every system, every species, had relied on the humans in some way. And now they were gone. No one had anticipated how deeply intertwined the humans had been in the fabric of galactic life. Their departure had left a hole so vast that it was impossible to fill. As the weeks turned into months, the full impact of the humans' withdrawal began to take shape. Leaders of the major galactic factions held urgent meetings, trying to piece together what was left of the system. But the longer the humans were gone, the more the reality set in. They were not coming back. The galaxy had taken humanity for granted, thinking that they could always count on the humans to clean up the messes they made. Now the messes were piling up, and no one knew how to fix them. In the meantime, whispers of a new power rising in the galaxy began to spread. These whispers spoke of a united front, a coalition of species that had once been dismissed as insignificant, now rising to take their place among the stars. The humans had always been the silent power behind the throne, holding everything together with their intellect, their technology, and their diplomacy. But now, it seemed, these smaller species had banded together in secret, building something stronger, something more resilient than anyone had ever imagined. The rumors were vague, but they were spreading like wildfire. Some said that these species had been preparing for this moment for years, quietly amassing strength while the galaxy's more powerful civilizations were distracted. Others claimed that the humans themselves had quietly supported this movement, setting the groundwork for the galaxy's future without them. Either way, the implications were clear. The balance of power in the galaxy was shifting. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the humans were watching as everything they had built slowly fell apart. They had known this would happen. It was the price of walking away from the negotiating table. But they had also known that the galaxy needed to see this, needed to feel the weight of their absence. The humans had been the peacemakers, the problem solvers, the ones who kept everything running smoothly. But the galaxy had never truly respected them. The humans had been the glue, but no one ever gave them credit for holding things together. Now, it was too late. The galaxy was in chaos, and the humans were no longer interested in fixing it. They had tried for years to bring peace, to maintain order. But in the end, their efforts had been taken for granted. The galaxy had expected the humans to always be there, to always fix their problems, and now they were paying the price for that overconfidence. As the galaxy spiraled into disarray, the humans stood at the edge, watching and waiting. They had made their point. They had shown the galaxy what would happen if they abandoned humanity's role. And they weren't going to fix it. They weren't going to pick up the pieces this time. Instead, they were letting the galaxy see the true cost of taking them for granted. But even as the galaxy began to fracture, there was a sense of something greater beginning to take shape in the shadows. The smaller species, once overlooked and underappreciated, were growing bolder, stepping into the space left by the humans. It wasn't that they were trying to replace humanity, but they were now realizing that they had the potential to carve out their own future. They had been relying on the humans for far too long. And now, without them, they had to learn to stand on their own. Some of these species began to form new alliances, their goals shifting from mere survival to dominance. They weren't looking for peace anymore. They were looking for power. They had seen what the humans had done, how they had maintained balance in the galaxy. And now, in the absence of that balance, they sought to take control of their own destinies. The shift was slow, but inevitable. The galaxy that had once been a carefully constructed web of alliances and agreements was now a place of uncertainty and change. The humans had stepped back, and in their absence, a new order was beginning to rise. The old systems were crumbling, and new players were emerging from the shadows. The galaxy, once united under human influence, was now divided, each faction scrambling to survive. But even in this chaos, one thing was clear. The humans' absence had set something in motion, something that no one could stop. The galaxy would never be the same again. And as the factions fought for power, one question hung over everything. Would anyone be able to put the pieces back together, or was this the beginning of the end for the galaxy as they knew it? In the quiet of space, as planets and stars turned in their orbits, the galaxy was slowly realizing the true cost of underestimating humanity. And in this vast emptiness, the humans knew something the galaxy did not. Sometimes, leaving the negotiating table wasn't just a refusal to cooperate. It was a declaration of intent, and the humans had made their declaration loud and clear. As the galaxy continued to spiral deeper into chaos, something unexpected started to emerge. Among the disarray, a quiet transformation was taking place. Factions that had once been dependent on the humans' leadership began to question their old ways, and some began to forge entirely new paths. These new coalitions, formed out of necessity, were starting to look less like the disjointed groups they had once been and more like unified forces with purpose. On the fringes of the galaxy, small, often overlooked species began to rise, their leaders growing bolder with each passing day. These species had always been marginalized by the larger, more powerful factions that had ruled the galaxy, but without the humans holding things together, they saw a rare opportunity. They were no longer content to simply exist in the shadows of the larger powers. They had learned from the humans' methods, how they built alliances, how they mediated conflict, and now they were ready to put those lessons into action. But there was a shift. They weren't interested in negotiation anymore. The absence of human leadership had turned them toward ambition, power, and control. Meanwhile, the larger galactic powers, once so confident in their dominance, were beginning to falter. The loss of the humans' diplomatic influence had left a gaping hole, and the instability that followed was having a profound effect on their once immovable positions. Alien leaders who had previously been content to sit on their thrones now found themselves questioning everything. How could they maintain their power without the humans to manage delicate peace deals? How could they keep their fleets and economies in line when no one could manage the intricacies of galactic politics anymore? The question that had been whispered at first, in hushed voices in dark corners of space, was now being asked aloud. Had the humans been the true backbone of the galaxy all along? The Zorvans, an aggressive militaristic species, had once relied on the human-led negotiations to prevent open conflict. With the humans absent, the Zorvans grew restless. Their thirst for power and territory began to bubble to the surface, and soon their soldiers were massing at the borders of several neighboring systems, testing the resolve of anyone who might oppose them. They were eager to prove that they could conquer without the need for treaties and diplomacy, but the Graysians, a species of peace-loving diplomats, saw this as a direct threat to their survival. They had once relied on the humans' influence to maintain the fragile peace they had worked so hard to achieve, but now, with their only protector gone, they were on their own. The first shots were fired when the Zorvans made their move on a Graysian colony. The Graysians, who had never fought a war in their history, were caught off guard. They had always depended on human intervention to solve their disputes. But with the humans nowhere in sight, they were forced to defend themselves, using technology they had never truly understood, fighting against an enemy they had always feared. The conflict quickly escalated. Other species began to take sides, either defending the Zorvans or supporting the Graysians. What had once been a galaxy held together by a delicate web of treaties was now a battlefield, and the alliances that humans had carefully crafted began to crumble one by one. No one could keep the peace. No one could control the chaos that was quickly spreading like wildfire. In the meantime, the humans watched from the distance, from their colonies on the edge of the galaxy. They had no intention of intervening. They had made their decision. The galaxy had failed to appreciate their role, their efforts, and their sacrifices. It was time for the galaxy to face the consequences of its actions. The humans were no longer interested in playing the peacemakers. They had walked away, leaving the galaxy to figure things out on its own. For the humans, it wasn't just a matter of revenge or punishment. It was a lesson they were teaching. The galaxy had taken them for granted, relying on their efforts to maintain the fragile balance of power. But now, They saw that the galaxy needed to realize its own weakness. The humans had always been the bridge between the factions, the ones who brought disparate species together for common cause. Without that bridge, the galaxy was left to crumble under the weight of its own ambitions. As the conflict between the Zorvans and the Grasians intensified, the rest of the galaxy began to watch with growing fear. The question of who would take control now was on everyone's mind. It was no longer about peaceful coexistence. It was about who could dominate the galaxy. The galaxy's leaders, once united by the guiding hand of humanity, now found themselves scrambling to maintain order. Their once immovable empires were beginning to falter, and cracks began to form in their fragile alliances. The news of the conflict spread like wildfire across the galaxy. Smaller factions, previously content to live in the shadows, now saw the unfolding chaos as their opportunity to rise. Among these factions was the Drawn, a species that had been at odds with many of the more established powers, but had always stayed out of the limelight. With the humans gone, the Drawn began to make their moves. They started securing territory and forming secret alliances, preparing to expand their influence, while the larger powers were distracted by their own infighting. There was a growing realization that the galaxy was no longer a place of peace or order. It was a battlefield. The humans had once been the shield, the one who stood between the chaos and the galaxy's fragile balance. But now that shield had been taken away, and all that was left was the chaos itself. Back on Earth, a small group of human leaders gathered in secret. They had watched the galaxy fall into disarray, and for the first time in years, they spoke openly about the future. They knew the time had come to reclaim their place in the galaxy, but their role would no longer be that of peacemakers. They would no longer serve as the diplomats or negotiators. Instead, they would return to the galaxy as something else entirely. They would return as rulers. The question of how the humans would assert their power was still unclear, but the leaders knew that their absence had shown the galaxy just how much it relied on them. The balance had been tipped. It was time for the humans to take the reins once again, but this time, they would do so on their own terms. The galaxy had underestimated them, but it was about to learn the hard way that humanity was not to be ignored. And so, while the galaxy burned, while factions fought, and alliances shattered, the humans prepared for their return. But this time, there would be no negotiations. There would be no compromises. The galaxy had failed them, and now they would claim their rightful place at the top. The stage was set for a new order, and in the darkness of space, the galaxy could feel it. A new power was rising, one that had learned from its past mistakes. The humans had walked away, but now they were coming back. And nothing would ever be the same again. Months had passed, and the galaxy was no longer the same. What had once been a tightly woven tapestry of alliances, treaties, and power structures was now unraveling, thread by thread. The galaxy's once peaceful systems had descended into chaos. Civil wars erupted, factions broke apart, and the once unified forces of the galaxy splintered into competing factions desperate to secure what little remained. The balance that the humans had so carefully maintained had been shattered, and now no one knew how to restore it. The Zorvans, after their initial success in crushing the Grasians, had begun their expansion in earnest. Their warships now patrolled the edges of the systems that once belonged to their enemies, and their borders expanded at a rapid pace. The Zorvans had realized something. Their ambition was not limited by the constraints of diplomacy. In fact, without the humans to mediate, they had free rein to carve out an empire of their own. The old, fragile alliances that had kept them in check were no longer standing in their way. They were free to pursue their imperialistic dreams, and they intended to do so with force. Meanwhile, the Grasians, devastated by their inability to defend themselves without the humans, found themselves on the brink of extinction. Without their technological support and the diplomatic power the humans had provided, they were vulnerable, and the Zorvans were not the only ones eyeing them. Other factions, sensing weakness, began to move in. The Grasians had once been known for their wisdom, and their influence over peace negotiations, but now they were nothing more than another fallen power in a galaxy descending into madness. At the same time, a new player was emerging, one that had been quietly building power in the shadows. The Drawn, a species once regarded as a minor nuisance in the galaxy, had begun to take significant action. While others fought for control of systems and resources, the Drawn focused on something more subtle: intelligence, influence, and information. They were beginning to position themselves as the galaxy's new puppet masters, manipulating events from behind the scenes. The galaxy was beginning to realize something. In the absence of humans, power was not just about strength. It was about who could pull the strings and control the flow of information. The Drawn, with their quiet, calculating strategies, understood this all too well. They didn't need to conquer with force. They needed to control minds, to bend alliances to their will. In a galaxy that was on the edge of collapse, the Drawn's subtle influence seemed more powerful than ever. Amidst this turmoil, a small but growing faction began to rise from the depths of obscurity, an alliance of species that had once been marginalized and dismissed by the larger powers. These smaller factions, who had watched the larger civilizations crumble, now realized that the galaxy had grown too unstable, too chaotic for the old order to hold. They began to unite under a common banner, seeking to build something new, something free from the old power structures that had allowed the Zorvans and other empires to rise unchecked. The new coalition was built on the idea of equality, of sharing resources, and of standing together against the larger powers that had long held control. But even as these smaller factions grew stronger, they too were feeling the absence of the humans. They may have had the ambition to overthrow the old powers, but they lacked the experience, the knowledge, and the technical expertise that the humans had brought to the table. They were strong in number, but weak in resources and technology. Without the humans, they found themselves forced to rely on old, outdated ships and weapons. They lacked the tools necessary to defend their new coalitions from the ever-growing threat of the Zorvans and other militaristic factions. It was clear that the galaxy needed the humans. Whether they wanted to admit it or not, the absence of humanity was leaving a hole in the very heart of galactic politics. The fragile peace, the diplomatic balance that had been carefully maintained for so long, was a distant memory. The galaxy had relied on the humans for so much, and now they had to face the consequences of their absence. And yet, the humans showed no sign of returning. Their message had been clear. They were done with the galaxy. They had pulled away from the negotiations, and they were no longer interested in fixing a system that had failed them. But as time went on, a strange thing began to happen. The smaller factions, those that had once been on the fringes of galactic society, began to question their dependence on the humans. They had learned how to survive without them. They had learned to build alliances, to forge their own technologies, and to fight without the humans' expertise. The idea of a galaxy without human intervention, though unsettling, had begun to take root. The larger powers were faltering, but the smaller, united factions were growing stronger. They had begun to see the cracks in the empire that had once been unbreakable. They began to wonder if it was time for a new order, one that didn't rely on humanity for everything. And in the midst of this growing uncertainty, there were whispers that the humans were still watching, that they had never truly left the galaxy, only withdrawn from the public eye. There were rumors, scattered across the galaxy like stardust, that the humans were quietly making their preparations. Some believed they were biding their time, waiting for the galaxy to fall apart so they could swoop in and restore order, but on their own terms. Others feared that the humans were simply waiting for the galaxy to implode, so they could step in and take control when there was nothing left to contest. The rumors of their return spread quickly, but no one knew what to believe. The humans had always been masters of surprise, and no one knew how they would return, or if they would return at all. Back on Earth, the leaders who had once guided the galaxy from behind the scenes were in their private chambers, speaking in hushed tones about the future. The choice before them was a simple one: Would they return to the galaxy and restore the old order, or would they create a new one from the ashes? The galaxy had failed them, and now it was time for them to decide how to move forward. But even as they pondered their future, there was a sense that things had irrevocably changed. The old order had broken down, and no one, not even the humans, could return to the way things once were. In the silence that followed, a single question echoed in the minds of the human leaders. Is this the galaxy's true moment of rebirth, or its final descent into chaos? As the galaxy stood at the crossroads, its fate hung in the balance. The humans were watching, waiting, and preparing. Whatever came next, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The future of the galaxy was uncertain, but one thing was certain. When the humans made their move, the galaxy would never forget. The galaxy had reached a tipping point, and it seemed as though there was no turning back. Factions that had once coexisted under the tenuous peace brokered by humans now stood on the brink of all-out war. Planets, once united in trade, diplomacy, and shared technology, were now battlegrounds, each system fighting for its survival in a galaxy that had lost its guiding hand. The old alliances were broken, and there was no one left who could restore the delicate balance that had once kept everything in place. The Zorvans had grown bolder with every passing day. Their once contained ambitions had expanded far beyond what anyone had predicted. With the Grasians in retreat and the larger galactic powers distracted, the Zorvans saw nothing but opportunity ahead of them. Their fleet now patrolled vast stretches of territory, and they made no secret of their intent to conquer more. Systems that had once thrived in peace now lived in fear of their ruthless military might. But their expansion came at a price. While their forces grew stronger, they began to stretch thin. Their resources, once abundant, were now dwindling under the weight of their endless conquests. The Zorvans had underestimated the complexity of maintaining an empire, especially without the guidance and wisdom the humans had once provided. Every new system they took, every new planet they absorbed, required more energy, more resources, and more lives. Their war machine, though fearsome, was starting to falter. Meanwhile, the Grasians, despite their dwindling numbers, refused to give up. They had once been proud diplomats and peacekeepers, and even now, in the midst of their greatest crisis, they clung to the hope that a peaceful solution might still exist. They formed alliances with smaller factions, hoping to build a resistance strong enough to push back against the Zorvans. But the odds were against them. The galaxy had become a place where power was no longer a matter of diplomacy. It was about who could hold the most guns, who could wield the largest fleets, and who had the strength to survive. On the other side of the galaxy, the smaller species who had once been overlooked now stood at a crossroads. They had learned the hard way that without the humans' intervention, they could no longer rely on the protections and guarantees that had once kept them safe. Some, like the Drawn, began to consolidate their power in secret. Using their advanced intelligence networks, they manipulated galactic events from the shadows, turning the chaos to their advantage. The Drawn understood that in this new galaxy, power didn't lie in brute force. It lay in control of information. They began to sabotage communications, distort the truth, and play factions against one another. They weren't interested in conquering planets, not in the traditional sense. What they sought was influence, control over the galaxy's flow of knowledge, trade, and military intelligence. In a fractured galaxy, where trust was in short supply, the Drawn were becoming more powerful by the day. But even as these smaller factions vied for power, the question still lingered in the background. What had happened to the humans? Were they still out there, watching from the periphery, waiting for their moment to return? Back on Earth, the humans were making their plans in silence. They had watched the galaxy crumble, and now they understood the consequences of their withdrawal. It was no longer just a matter of peacekeeping. It was about power. The humans had once been the glue that held the galaxy together, but their absence had shown them something. They had been more than just diplomats. They had been the true rulers of the galaxy, keeping the fragile peace through sheer force of will. And now, That power, that leadership, was needed more than ever. The human leaders, in secret meetings, began to discuss the future. They knew that the galaxy was on the verge of collapse. They had once tried to maintain peace through negotiation, but now they saw that a different kind of leadership was required. The galaxy needed order, true order, and the only way to achieve that was through control. The humans had walked away from the negotiating table, but now it was clear that they would need to return. However, this time, they would not return as the peacemakers. They would return as the rulers. It was a decision that wasn't made lightly. The humans had always believed in diplomacy, in working together with other species to solve problems. But they had learned something vital during their time away. The galaxy wasn't capable of governing itself. It had always needed them. It had always depended on them, whether it realized it or not. And now, the galaxy was on the brink of self-destruction. The leaders of Earth began to put their plans into motion. They weren't just going to intervene. They were going to take control. They would form an alliance, but this time, it would be an alliance on their terms. The humans were going to reclaim the power they had once held and make the galaxy recognize them as the true rulers. They would restore order to the chaos, but they would do it their way. The days of peaceful negotiation were over. The humans understood the risks. The galaxy had changed since they left, and not all factions would be willing to accept their return. But they were ready. They had the technology, the military might, and the sheer determination to bring the galaxy back under their control. They knew that they had to move quickly before the galaxy fell apart completely. And so, they began to prepare. The first move was a quiet one, sending a fleet to the outskirts of known space to make sure that the galaxy knew they were still watching. It wasn't a show of force, not yet, but the message was clear. We are still here. We have not forgotten. The fleet was a symbol, a reminder to the galaxy that humanity had not been vanquished. They were merely waiting, biding their time, until the galaxy was ready to accept their leadership once again. As the weeks turned into months, rumors of the humans' return began to spread across the galaxy. At first, many dismissed them as nothing more than whispers, stories told in the dark corners of space, where those who still remembered humanity's power gathered to dream of a time when the galaxy was united under their rule. But as the humans' fleet grew larger, as their presence became undeniable, the whispers began to grow louder. The galaxy was once again on the brink of something monumental. The smaller factions, the power-hungry empires, and the struggling species all felt the tremors of what was coming. The question was no longer if the humans would return, but when. And what would that mean for the galaxy? In the darkest corners of space, there was a growing fear. The humans were coming back, and no one knew what they would do once they arrived. Would they seek revenge for the galaxy's failure to appreciate them? Would they demand the galaxy's total submission? Or, as some hoped, would they return as the peacemakers once again, willing to rebuild the fragile alliances that had been lost? The galaxy waited, holding its breath. The humans were coming, and with them, a new era was about to begin. One thing was certain: the galaxy would never be the same again. The galaxy had never been in such a state of disarray. Wars raged in the shadows of collapsing civilizations. Power-hungry factions clashed, while others fought desperately to preserve what little peace remained. The once thriving galactic networks that humanity had helped to build were now nothing more than broken remnants of a distant, more hopeful past. The leaders of the galaxy had failed to realize how much they depended on humanity until they were gone. And now, in the absence of the humans, there was no one left with the wisdom or strength to heal the rift that had torn the galaxy apart. The Zorvans had become an unstoppable force. Their aggression knew no bounds, as they systematically took control of the most valuable planets in the galaxy. Yet even as their forces grew, so did their arrogance. They believed themselves invincible, their power unchecked, but their grasp was slipping. Each victory took more resources, more lives, and the cracks in their military might were beginning to show. The Zorvans had learned, too late, that ruling through force was a heavy burden. Their once unified people were now divided, the leaders of their fleets vying for control of the expanding empire. The Grasians, despite their severe losses, had not abandoned hope. They formed fragile coalitions with the remaining peaceful factions, but each agreement was met with skepticism. The galaxy had lost its faith in diplomacy. Species that had once depended on the humans to navigate the intricacies of peace were now scrambling to survive, fighting to maintain their sovereignty, even as their governments fractured. And then there were the Dron, whose power was steadily growing. They had mastered the art of subversion, shaping events from behind the scenes. Their ability to manipulate information, control communication channels, and stir unrest among the galaxy's leaders gave them an advantage that few others could even comprehend. The Dron weren't interested in ruling planets. They were focused on controlling the flow of information, destabilizing the galaxy, and tipping the balance of power in their favor. Their influence was growing like a shadow over the galaxy, one that few could see coming. As the turmoil spread, the smaller factions, species that had once been disregarded, began to rise. They had learned the harsh lessons of survival in a galaxy without the humans to rely on. Some of them even began to see the absence of humanity not as a curse, but as an opportunity. With the larger powers distracted, these lesser-known species saw the chance to assert their own independence and power. They quietly built alliances and pooled their resources, waiting for the right moment to strike. But amid all the chaos, one question haunted the galaxy. Where were the humans? The rumors had been circulating for months, but no one knew for certain if they were true. Were the humans really gone, or were they simply waiting for the right moment to re-enter the galactic stage? Whispers echoed through the galaxy's most distant corners. Some believed that humanity had simply given up on a galaxy that had grown too corrupt. Others thought they were lying in wait, preparing for their moment to strike. The truth, however, was more complex. Back on Earth, human leaders met in secret, in a quiet room away from prying eyes, far from the chaos that was consuming the galaxy. They had watched the galaxy's spiral into turmoil, knowing full well the consequences of their departure. They had felt the sting of betrayal, the weight of a galaxy that had failed to appreciate their efforts. It had taken time for the humans to come to this conclusion, but now they were certain. The galaxy had grown beyond saving. It had crumbled, and it needed to be rebuilt. The human leaders had reached a decision. They would no longer act as diplomats, the negotiators or peacemakers they had once been. They had given the galaxy enough chances. The humans would return, not to save the galaxy, but to rule it. To bring order from the chaos they had created, but on their terms. They would reclaim their place in the galaxy, and they would do it by force, if necessary. The galaxy would learn, in the hardest possible way, that peace could not exist without them. The first step was a bold one, quiet, yet unmistakable. Humanity sent an advanced fleet, far beyond what anyone had seen before, to the outer rim of the galaxy. The fleet was equipped with technology that could eclipse anything the galaxy had ever known, weapons capable of leveling entire planets, and the strategic minds that had once brokered peace across the stars. This was not an act of aggression. Not yet. It was a statement. The message was clear. The humans had returned, and they were watching. They were not the saviors they once were, nor the diplomats or advisors they had been. They were now the masters of their domain, and they would not stand by as the galaxy fell further into anarchy. News of the fleet spread quickly. The galaxy trembled. Factions of every size and strength stopped what they were doing to focus on the threat, or promise, depending on who you asked, that humanity represented. Leaders of the Zorvans, the Grasians, the Dron, and every other power scrambled to assess the situation. They tried to decipher humanity's intentions, to understand whether they had returned to reclaim their dominance, or simply to watch as everything continued to collapse. The galaxy held its breath. Among the smaller factions, there was a growing realization. They had underestimated humanity's true strength. The humans were not the weak, fallen race some had imagined. They were watching, learning, and preparing. The galaxy had failed them, and now it was time to pay the price. It was clear that humanity would not be satisfied with merely watching the galaxy descend into chaos. They would not stand idly by as new powers rose from the ashes. The question was not whether the humans would return. They had already come back. The real question was how the galaxy would respond. As the humans continued to prepare for the inevitable confrontation, whispers of their return spread like wildfire across the galaxy. Every faction, large or small, began to make preparations, some fortifying their systems, others attempting to make alliances that would secure their place in the coming new order. The Zorvans knew they could not keep expanding without facing the full force of humanity. The Gratians, weakened but not defeated, began to rebuild their forces in secret, hoping they could broker a peace before the humans arrived in full force. The Drawn tightened their grip on the flow of information, uncertain whether they should support or sabotage humanity's return. But amid the fear and uncertainty, there was one undeniable truth. The galaxy was about to change once more. The stage was set for the return of humanity, and no one, no species, no faction, no power, knew what the humans would do next. Would they impose order, or would they let the galaxy destroy itself? Would they return as ruthless conquerors, or would they try to restore the peace that had once been their greatest gift to the stars? One thing was for certain: the humans were back, and the galaxy would never be the same again.